Okay, so Baruch Hashem, last week we finished Perek Hazov, and certainly the last few blot was a lot of Agadata. It was very, very complicated, deep Agadata, which is sometimes is more difficult to understand. So now we're starting the fifth Perek Eza Neshech, which is as practical can be, because we're talking about ribis and those things that affect all of us all the time. And we'll all learn together how careful we have to be as to what ribis is, because it's not as straightforward as many of us think. Oh yeah, I can't lend the money, take it. There's a lot of complications, and so we're gonna open this up today with the Mishnah, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, but this is a very topical subject. Okay, we're up to Samach Omid Beis, the Mishnah. So the Mishnah first asks, now with ribis, there are different words used to describe ribis. The Torah uses the word neshech. In fact, I have the pasuk here. Let's take a quick look because I think it's going to be important to understand that. All right, so we have several psukim here in Parshas Bahar. The first one is Lamed Vav. Al tikach meito neshech. You should not take neshech, whatever that means. V'tarbis and tarbis. V'yaresim elokecha v'chayochichi imach. So that's the first pasuk where it references both neshech and tarbis. We're using those words and we'll define them shortly, but those are the words in the Torah. The next pasuk goes on and says, "Es kaspecha lo yitin lo b'neshech." Your money you should not take neshech. Ubemarbis lo sitan ochlecha. And marbis, which is ribis, lo sitan ochlecha, you shouldn't take from the food that I guess you give out. So this is, at this point, it's a little cryptic. What does this all mean? Neshech and tarbis, neshech by kesef, tarbis by oichel. What does it all mean? So with that in mind, we're going to start with the Mishnah. Eza neshech ve'eza tarbis. What is the meaning of neshech, and what is the meaning of tarbis, and why do we have different words? I mean, we know it by the common term of ribis. In fact, there are several. It's tarbis, it's marbis, it's ribis. These are all words referring to the same thing, and we generalize to say you can't take ribis. Okay, meaning by definition interest. In other words, if you so what is neshech and what is tarbis? Says the Mishnah, neshech, that neshech means hamalve sela behe dinorin. If someone I lend you, David, I lend you a sela, which is 4 dinorim in a sela, and you pay me back 5 dinorim. That's as clear as anything that you're paying me back more than I lent you, and that's neshech. Okay, another example. Sosayim chitim b'shlosha. I lend you 2 saw. Saw is equivalent of it's a measurement for flour, and I get back 3. So those are clear cases. Osir m'tu shehu noshech, because I'm lending you something that I'm getting back more than I gave you. Now, the word neshech comes from the Torah word, the root word, which is noshach. And noshach, by definition, is when you bite someone or you bite something, that's called noshach. So using the word neshech, it's really a takeoff that you're biting the borrower. Why? Because you're making him come up. It's an interesting way of describing it, but the halacha says that you're biting because you're making him pay you. It's painful. No, it's painful on the borrower because he has to give you back more than he got. And that's
Rabbi, can I ask a question? And I may be reading ahead, but I'm probably not. If if the borrower decides out of gratitude to give the extra money or whatever it is as a gift, is that permissible?
not in the same transaction. There's nothing wrong with my giving you a gift, of course. But if it's tied to the loan, that's neshech. If it's not tied to the loan, it's two separate transactions. I lend you four, you give me back four, and separate and apart, I give you a matana. But as long as it's not appearing and tied to the loan, that's okay.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what page? We're on Bava Metzia, right? You said Samach Bet, Samach.
Samach Omed Bet. Samach Omed Bet.
There's a mission.
Yeah, it's a new parak.
Oh,
And
okay.
we're doing the
Oh,
Mishnah.
Eza
Eza
Neshek.
Neshech. Eza Neshech. So, all right. So the word noshach means to bite. And we can understand that when you're lending somebody money or food and he has to pay you back more, it's like a bite. It's like a painful bite to the borrower. That's how the Torah describes Neshech. And that gives us a picture of Neshech. Okay, we've described Neshech. What is Tarbis? Says the Mishnah, Ve'eza Tarbis. What is Tarbis? Um, so now take a look carefully. Hamarba beperos. I lend you something and I'm increasing my holdings, my property, um, through through payros, meaning through goods, not money, but goods. That's generally, and we're going to get into more specific, that's what's called tarbis. Ketzad. So give me an example, says the Mishnah. What does it mean? Okay, went along and I bought. Kur again is a measurement. It's tied to dinarim and kur. We'll put that aside for the moment. So if I bought wheat from you for one zav kur, one gold dinar for a kur, right? So that's what I paid. V'chein ashar. Okay, this is an important word. We're going to dig down in more specific. But v'chein hashar, and that was the prevailing price. That was what the market price was, right? The market price was, um, um, uh, I bought chitin for a kur for dinar zav, for a dinar zav. That's what I bought. Okay, now a gold. I think we had this in the previous Gemara already, but one dinar zahav, one gold dinar, is equivalent to 25 silver dinar. We'll see this all explained a little bit more in Rashi. So a gold dinar equals 25 silver dinar, and I went ahead and I bought from you and I paid a gold dinar. And that was the market. Everybody knew that was the price in the market. Now, what happened? So it's a lot of wheat. I didn't need it all. So I asked you, the seller, I'm going to take half or whatever the amount is, and I'm going to leave you half so that I can take it later. Right? Now, in the meantime, omdu chitten belamed dinarim. The chitin went up from 25 silver dinar to 30. Okay, so now l'chaira, it's increased in value. That smacks of something. What do we do with that? Says the Mishnah. Now that it is 30 dinar, omalo. So I came to you and I said, "Ten li chatoi." Give me the balance of my wheat. Okay, you gave me part of it. I want the balance now. Why? Shani roitze because I want to sell it. Velikach bohem yayin, and I want to buy wine. So in other words, I took half of the wheat. The other half I left with you. In the meantime, it went from 25 dinar to 30 silver dinar, right? So there is an increase. And I say, give me back the 30 dinar so I can go ahead and buy wine. All right. So now this is what this so the seller who's holding the wheat says as follows. Omalo, he says to the buyer, Harechatecha asiyas olai b'shloshim. I will obligate myself for your wheat b'shloshim. In other words, I recognize that it's worth shloshim, and I will pay you shloshim. But instead of my giving you the money, I can also supply you with the wine. V'harei l'cho etzli behen yayin. And you can now you can come to me and say, please give me wine for 30 dinar. Because he's a kolbo. He's not just a wheat dealer. He deals in all kinds of produce. He says, why do you go somewhere else? I'll give you credit for 30 and I'll sell you the wine, the equivalent of 30. One problem. V'yayin ein lo. But he has no wine at hand. So the fellow who is looking for the wine can't get the wine right now because the seller doesn't have it. So the seller says, but I promise that I'll give you the wine for 30 dinar. Okay, so now let's think about this for a minute. What's the problem? The problem is that when he bought it for a gold dinar, which is 25 silver dinar. If he had taken the entire thing, no problem, transaction over. But he didn't take the entire. He said, I'm going to take part and I'm going to leave the part for later. Now that's already opens up the question. All right, so what's pshat? I'll take it later. What am I taking yours? Am I taking mine? What am I taking?
Is he a shomer? Is the one who's selling it a shomer of any type?
Well, he's not specifically a shomer, but if he gets if someone rips him off or it gets he owes him that it's not a shmira, it's a mechira, but he owes him the money. He owes
Rabbi,
him.
can I understand
But it's actually stuff. He actually has stuff that he didn't pick up.
That's right.
Well, Rabbi, can I understand the circumstances here?
Go ahead.
Did he actually buy the wheat and he's asking him to house it for him
Correct.
later?
Correct.
Okay. So it's his and it's not on layaway because he owns it, but he's asking him to store it. As
Correct.
So he's saying in this case that, I want it back at the higher value. I want my, but he could give him the wheat, the same amount of wheat, which is worth more, and return that to him.
Correct.
Is the seller saying, I'm not going to do that? Or is the buyer saying, I don't want that?
No. You're hitting on something very important. The buyer can only take half the wheat. He doesn't have the ability to take the half wheat. The seller has a silo. He keeps it in the silo.
Okay.
Now, everything is good. The only difference is that the value of the wheat increased, as you pointed out, and he comes back and says, I want my wheat. And I know that the price of wheat is now 30 dinrum instead of 25. So if you'll give me the wheat, which is now worth 30, I now want to trade it for yayin, for wine. Okay, so is there anything wrong with this? What do you think? You think that there's a problem here?
Well, I think it depends on the terms. So if he says, you're
give
holding
back the
this
wheat.
for me, I mean, is there a storage charge for him keeping it? I mean, he's
No.
paying for it.
No storage charge.
However that.
Okay.
But he
No
can.
storage charge.
So
he
all
has
he's
an
saying,
option. He has an option to give him back the wheat.
right,
He doesn't have to
Correct.
get involved with the price of the wheat.
right.
Correct. So so there's two things to think about here before we go weiter. And Michael, you hit on one of them. If you say that the buyer owns the wheat, then when it appreciated in price, it appreciated on his watch, not on the seller's watch.
Correct.
So it's my property. There's no ribbis because I own it. but it has to be mine. Has to be mine. So now, again, Rashi will give us more detail. So Stamazoi, when you look at it, you'll say, "Oh, this is ribis." He bought it for 25, and now he's getting back 30, so that he's taking back ribis on his purchase. So the answer to that is it's not ribis. Why is it not ribis? So the we'll see more in the Gemara. There are two reasons why it's not ribis. Two reasons, and they both stem from the same thing. The first, why is it not ribis, is because, like we said before, what's called yesh lo. We'll see what that means, but it's what you said, Michael. It's mine. I own it. And if I own it and you're holding it for me, so you're not giving me back something that I don't already own. And therefore, because I own it, and it's as if I bought the whole thing, and the increase was on my watch, on my purchase. Fine. There's a second way of looking at this, and that is what happens if the seller does not have the other wheat. Remember, the first situation is where he has the whole wheat, and I'm only taking half of it, and the other half I'm leaving, but it's mine. What happens if he only has half the wheat when he sells it to him? And the buyer says, I want the half of that wheat, and the other half I'll take later. Does that somehow make a difference? Because the seller doesn't have the wheat, so when he gets the wheat later and pays it back, that looks like ribbis.
But if he paid for it, it says it doesn't matter when he gets it. It's going to be at the price that he bought it at. So if he keeps it for another month or two and the price goes up, well, he still paid the higher amount, so he gets it.
No, but David, if he paid 25 dinar for that kur, and it's now worth 30, he's going to get back from the seller additional 5, whatever it is, kur, a bushel, and that's ribbis. By definition, that means I'm getting more than I bargained for. I paid for this.
because it's a question of the stipulation. But if the stipulation is I'm taking half now, I'll come back and get half later, equivalent to that, the seller presumably has the option to give him that amount of wheat, same grade, that week back, or to pay him at the higher amount because it was his at that point. He invested in that. He said he had it. He doesn't have to prove that he did or didn't have it unless the contract stipulated such that it's the same wheat that he bought from. Then he has an option, and that's not ribbis because he bought it all at that point in time.
Okay, so to your point earlier, Michael, the reason why when the whole transaction was in front of him and he only took half of the produce and he left the other half with the seller, he owns the whole thing, but the seller's holding it for him. I understand when the price goes up, it's not the seller's price that's going up. It's the buyer who has an increase in his value, no problem. But what happens when I buy from you and all you have to give me is one half of the purchase? You don't have the other. All you have is 50% of the purchase.
Well,
is that different because now the valuation, the increase is on the seller's side, not on the buyer's side, because the buyer doesn't have.
What happened to the other half?
The number shouldn't have any stay in it because it was already paid for. So
the other half is still exists in the world. It's at the other person's house where he'll watch half.
Okay, so
not like it's not missing.
This is selling commodities in today's world, but
right. But the halacha says that if I'm selling you something and I don't have everything that I need to sell you, then that's a problem because since I don't have it, I have to acquire it, and if it's going to cost more, that appears to be ribis.
Well, are you saying that it is forbidden for the seller to sell something he doesn't have,
Correct.
according to halacha?
Correct. Except, what did we just say in the Mishnah? In the Mishnah, I pointed out that when we were saying tarbis, we said v'chein hashar. And I said we'll go over that and we'll explain. V'chein hashar means that the market price, the price that's out there officially, is 25 dinar, which means, now this is the chap. What means is, even though the seller doesn't have it in his possession, if he were to take the money that he just got, the 25 dinar, and immediately go out into the marketplace and buy the produce, he would get 25 dinar worth of produce, and it would be as if he had it. So the answer to your question is, Michael, that if you don't have it, it's a problem. But if the market is so clear that that's what it isn't murky, that he can go and say, okay, I don't have it. But if I went out now and bought it, I would get 25.
But Rabbi, isn't the contract stipulate this, that the distinction between I'm buying this, I'm buying a whole core, or whatever you want to say the quantity is now, but I'm taking half now. And at the time that I want the other half, you will provide that or the equivalent dollar value of what it is, because you also have the risk of it going down as well as going up. So
but wait a minute, but he paid 25 and he's getting back 30 dinar.
no, because at that point you're saying you're selling it at that price, and it's a promise to deliver whenever I want it at that price.
Right.
If the contract so stipulates, it's not ribis because you've made that distinction. But if it's a generic, at that point, and you're presuming that the value is going to be the same and it's not, then you have a different problem. So that's why it's up to the language of the contract, how specific. And I guess what you're saying is that if there is no stipulation, what's the halacha?
Right. So the halacha states that in order for it to be a purely, let's say, kosher transaction, I have to pay you and you have to give me the item. That's at face value.
So there's no future purchase allowed under halacha.
So future purchases is going to be the subject of a detailed discussion whether a future purchase is allowed. You're absolutely right. Is a future purchase allowed because it's going to look like ribis?
Excuse
But
me,
he's
Rabbi.
buying it. He's not hedging it. He's buying it. He paid for the whole.
No. Right. He's buying it, but when he gets possession of the second half, it's more than he bargained for, and by definition, that's ribis.
But
Because you see what he can do here. He can take this 30 dinar and buy something else for 30, but he only paid 25 to start. He should only have 25 dinar worth of wine, not 30 dinar. So
Rabbi,
yeah.
Sorry. Are we mixing up two things here? The scenario starts with a substance, wheat or whatever it is, and suddenly he only takes half delivery, and now the discussion switches to the value of everything.
Correct.
Why do we change it from the wheat into money and make a whole big deal about the money? I don't understand what license do we have to switch the scenario right in the middle and change the agenda.
Okay, because remember I read you a pasuk in the Torah, and the pasuk in the Torah in Bahar says, Es kaspecha lo sitin lo beneshech, money you should not take neshech, ubemarbis, and with ribis lo sitin ochlecha. You shouldn't take food for ribis. This is the example of food for ribis. I understand your concern. You're saying, I bought the food. What difference does it make what the value is? But the Torah says that the value has to be what you paid for, not what it is later. And if it's later, then it appears to be ribis. That's how sensitive we are to ribis, is that the prices have to be exact from when you bought it to when you delivered it. So one answer we gave is, that if the seller has all of the produce in his silo and I only want a part of it, I own the whole thing, but I want a part of it. If it goes up later, then it goes up on the buyer's cheshbon. I just gained, I own it, and I left it, and now I have a dinar more worth of wheat than I started with. No one has a problem with that because it's owned by the buyer.
Rabbi, one
Where do we
question
have a
on that.
problem?
Does
Sorry?
he does he have to earmark that additional wheat?
No,
As,
no. It's as long as he has it. He may be a seller and he has 50 buyers,
right.
but he has all of the stuff in his
But
silo.
halachically, he doesn't have to say that's your
No,
your
no, absolutely not. So that we understand. But what happens when I come to you, Michael, and I say, I want to buy a kur, but I only want a half a kur today? And the seller says, you're in luck. I have a half a kur. I don't have more, but I have a half a kur. Now it opens the door to a problem because if later on, since the buyer doesn't have it yet, remember in the first case, the buyer has it, except he leaves it by the seller. The buyer doesn't have it. He's relying on the seller to find it and give it to him. Then when it increases in price, that's ribis. Now,
but
we
that's
have
not
an
the same transaction. He's only able to sell a half a core until we learn how you can buy future amounts. Since that's all he has, according to this
so the halacha
definition, he
is
can only buy a half core because that's all he has to sell.
right. So let's just establish that the halacha is that when you buy something, you have to own all of it and it has to be in your possession. If it's not in your possession, it raises a problem. So in the case where he bought it and asked the other fellow to have it, but the seller had it, he had it, except that the buyer says, I don't want it now. Clearly it belongs to the buyer. No problem. The problem arises when the seller sells it and says, I don't have all of it now. I'm going to have to get you the other half. And the buyer says, okay. Now he comes back a week later and says, I want the rest of my wheat. And the seller says, okay, but now I'm going into the marketplace and it's costing me 5 dinar more to buy what you bought a week ago. So
but isn't that part of the negotiation, Rabbi? Because he can say, the seller can say, look, I'll take the risk, whatever you want. I will provide you with the other half core when you want it. Give me the price now, and I'll take the risk. I'm not allowed to do it if I don't take the risk. But if the risk is the other way, then it has to so stipulate in the agreement.
Okay.
And
So
then the buyer's taking the risk at what he has to pay at that point in time. Neither of those is ribis, as long as he's truthful about what he actually had to pay for.
okay, so two things. The term risk doesn't really apply here. I know what you're saying, but the risk doesn't come into the equation here. What comes into the equation very clearly is possession. Possession, what do we say? Possession is 9/10 of the law. I mean, you have to possess it. You have to have it. It has to be readily
So a
available.
seller can't sell it without possessing it.
Correct. Correct. Now, there is an exception. We carve out an exception. What's the exception? The Mishnah says, V'chein hashar. What does it mean, V'chein hashar? V'chein hashar means that when I sold it to you and you took half of it, it was established in the market. It was now this is a chap. It was established in the market that it took 25 dinar, silver dinar, to buy this kur. The seller doesn't have the kur, but if he immediately took the money the buyer gave him, he's giving him the whole money. If he gave him the whole money, he could turn around and buy that immediately from another seller and he'd pay 25. That's the important thing, is that he has the ability to get that instantly. That's an exception to the rule of if you don't have it, it's ribis. In other words,
what happens if he isn't able to get it?
And he has to buy it for him. If I'm buying from you 10 pounds, and you
David,
say
you don't have to buy it. You have to have the ability to buy it. According to this, you have to have the ability to take the money that the buyer is giving you, turn around and say to another seller,
That's
sell.
the seller you're talking about has to have the
I'm talking to
ability.
the seller. The seller
So,
just took
so
he,
this, so
he
this
just
whole
took the
tran- so
seller
this
just
whole
took the money from the
transaction,
buyer, right? Seller took the money from the buyer, gave him half, and doesn't have the other half. But he can
So,
immediately go to the guy in the next stall,
right.
and say,
but
"Here's my money. Give me that."
so
But
you're
that's wiping out what
introducing,
you
Rabbi, you're
established in
One at a
introducing
time. One at a time. Jay, go ahead.
you're introducing a different kind of transaction,
Right.
saying that in this particular scenario, people are buying items even though the seller doesn't have the item.
Correct.
Get it later. It's not a question of a half or not a half or three quarters or whatever. It's the fact that the buyer who wants to buy something doesn't have a problem with the seller telling him, I don't have all of it. I have to get it later.
Right.
Versus, I have it all right now and I will set it aside at the warehouse.
Correct.
So,
Correct.
so this is a totally different kind of transaction.
It is.
Regular
And so the
transaction.
Mishnah is telling us an example of tarbis, of ribis, by food, by food. Remember, this isn't a loan. And that's going to be an important distinction we'll talk about. Neshech has to do with I lend you and you pay me back more. Ribis has to do with a business transaction, not a loan. And in this business transaction, if it appears that I am making a profit on your sale, that's called ribis. Now we got to break it down. Why is it called ribis? It's called ribis because when I bought that kur for 25 dinar, the transaction is finished and I walk away. But wait a minute, I can't walk away because I left half the kur by you. But since the kur is in your possession, important note, it's in your possession, it's as if I own it and you're holding it for me. If it goes up 5 dinar, who gets the benefit? The buyer, because he owns it. Now, the next case, in contradistinction, if the seller says, I'm selling you 25 dinar worth a kur for 25 dinar, but I only have a half. And the buyer says, I'm in luck because I only need a half. I don't need the whole thing. Now the question comes, and this is where there's some confusion here, but some question comes, where is that produce? The buyer owns it, but doesn't have it. Now that he's going to get it and it's going to cost more, that's ribis.
But he
Because,
doesn't own it yet.
no, he does own it because,
It's something he has to go buy.
right.
So it's not like the seller owns it. He
So
doesn't
the
own
halacha
it.
states that if the buyer can walk away with all of his produce at one time, and then he's fine, even if later on it's worth more, but he could have walked away with all of his produce.
It was
But if
all
the
there.
buyer cannot walk away with his produce, because all the seller has to give him is 50% of his produce.
Yeah,
He
but
is
Rabbi,
not
that's a futures contract as opposed to the other situations like
exactly,
dividend. It's a
Michael,
different transaction.
and a futures contract is prohibited because of ribis.
So then how this can't possibly be the case because things can change in a heartbeat. The market can change in a heartbeat. So if he pays for it with the understanding, I'm paying you 25. I understand. I want the full amount. I don't need it all today. A week later, I'll get it. The market is established as of right now, and I'm taking the other half a week from today, and you're going to provide it. That is a sealed contract, and
And
he
there's no
can't
ribis.
charge more no matter what he has to pay.
So Michael, that's an example of no ribis. You're right. That's no ribis.
But that's the way it should be.
Right.
But if the contract goes the other way and says, look, I don't have it, but the risk on the rest is what it's going to cost me when I get the rest.
That's ribis.
That is a separate part of the transaction that is contingent on what the price is.
And that's ribis.
But suppose he paid
But
the
it's not
full amount.
ribis.
It is ribis. Well, okay, you said something very important, and that is that if at the time that the buyer paid the seller, paid him the whole money, The seller now has the money that he can use for whatever he wants, basically, okay, and he's giving him half the produce. But there's no market price. There isn't an established, the market price is all over the place. It's like futures, up, down, sideways. There's no market price, which means if the seller, after the transaction, a half an hour later, goes back into the market and now it costs him more because the futures price went up. It costs him more than what he gave half an hour ago. Says the halacha, that's ribis. Why? Because the exception to the rule of when I don't have it in my possession, which by the way automatically opens you up to ribis because I don't have it, and that's what ribis means, is that later on I have to acquire something and it'll cost more.
But then you shouldn't be allowed to sell. If that's the case,
yeah,
then it's contractually sealed. You either affirm it at the time and so the seller says, I can get you that, and I will get it for the same price when you need it, and this is locked in. It's certitude for you, and this is the case, and then I'm taking the risk one way or another. Then the buyer knows what the risk is and is willing to pay that. That is certitude. If you're saying that the halacha does not allow a contingent price where the price goes up and benefits the seller, but if it benefits the buyer, it's okay.
No, if the price fluctuates up or down, then I mean, basically the buyer is buying it for a certain amount of money, and if now it's worth more money and he can trade it in for something for more money, then he's gotten ribis. It's as if I buy for 20 and I'm giving you 20 and you're giving me 25.
He bought wheat. In your example, he bought the wheat.
Right.
He's not taking it now. He bought the wheat. The seller says, I don't have it. I will get it. When you want it, I will have it. And this is the price that we agreed to for it.
Okay.
And it's my risk what to get it for. And
okay.
So if it goes up or down, the buyer has the wheat that he was promised for the price he promised. And the merchant that's his risk that is in the agreement. It's embedded in the agreement. Why is that not allowed?
Okay, because I'll tell you why, Michael, because you're using a term that the halacha doesn't recognize. The word risk, which we understand in our parlance, that when you buy something, you take a risk up or down, that doesn't exist by ribis. Ribis is very straightforward, factual. It doesn't mean that I took a chance, that I didn't take a chance. Did the price go up? If the price goes up and I have more value than I bought, we're sensitive to that, and we say that's ribis. You have to understand, ribis is not what you understand to be interest, maybe in the common term, is it doesn't apply. Ribis only applies in halachic terms when two things happen. I buy something from you, and you can't deliver all the goods. Now it's contingent on your finding the goods later and giving it to me. And if it goes up in price, it's ribis, except if there was established price that it was 25 dinar, the seller could have, he didn't have to, he could have immediately turned to his guy in the next stall and say, I'm short a half a kur, sell me a half a kur for 25 dinar. He says, of course. Then it's as if the buyer bought the whole thing at one time and he's leaving half of it by the seller. So Michael, it's a different mindset than what you're thinking about.
The mandate should be you can only sell what you have now, and that's a separate transaction for when I can get it, and I'll sell it to you then.
Right.
You should not allow, because the halacha then is allowing the potential for ribis to occur.
Right.
So if you want certitude, then it should only be what you can take at that point.
You are 100% right. That's why there is something which we're going to learn about called psika al haperos, And that is what you said before, a future contract on Paris, psika ala Paris, and that psika ala Paris becomes problematic. And the rabbis say you can't make a futures contract because of the reason you just said. I don't have it. I have to wait for it to come later. And if it comes later and it's more money, then it appears to be a windfall for the buyer because he now gets 30 dinar worth of. It's the same chitin. Let's not mistake. It's the same half of a kur, but it's worth more, so he can translate it into 30 dinar and he can buy something for 30 instead of 25, which he paid. So the whole thing has to do with whether or not he's getting a windfall in the value, not in the chitin. He's still getting the same kur, half and half, but the value of the kur goes up. That's called psika ala peiros, and that is prohibited by the Rabbanon because it appears to be ribis. Now, you're 100% right when you grapple. That's why I say this is a very difficult thing to grapple with because you're thinking it in terms of our modern day business dealings. And in modern day business dealings, people arbitrage, they buy on risk, they do all these other things, and it's perfectly acceptable. From a halacha standpoint, we're saying that if you hedge your bet, and you wind up making a windfall on food or on produce that again, the whole idea of a commodities market is it's going to be future produce. So it's not here today. So on future produce, if you make a windfall, that's the definition of ribis. That is ribis.
Rabbi, can I ask a clarifying question? If
Sure.
if the seller has a silo full of wheat
Yes.
and he paid 25 for it, but the market goes to 30, but he paid 25, is
Right.
he allowed to sell that at 30 when the market changes?
Whatever wasn't pledged to a buyer, he can sell for whatever he wants. If it was pledged to a buyer because he's housing it for him, then it's the buyers, not the sellers.
Well,
The buyer
I don't
owns it.
understand why that isn't the distinction always made. It's either the sellers or the buyers.
We're making that
Why you
distinction.
why there's an exception for, well, he can get that easily, that that he should be locked in. It should cement him for the price that was at that time.
Okay.
And there shouldn't be this exception.
I understand your question. The reason why this exception exists is because it's clear to everyone that the buyer can get his entire purchase at one time. How? Half of it because the seller has it in his silo, and the other half because he can get it for the same amount of money that he's selling. Once he can get it for the same amount of money, it's as if he had it.
But if you believe that, then it should be locked at that point, and whatever happens from the seller standpoint, however much he pays, more or less, since you locked it in at that point, and he says that's what the market is at this point, I can get it for you. It should be of no difference to the buyer because he's getting his stuff at the price he paid, and then the risk is on the seller. I know there's no such thing as risk, but there's de facto risk in what he has to pay for.
Okay, but Michael, he's buying a commodity, a kur. He's got to get a kur, not dinarim. He's not.
Yes, I understand that. But
so if he's getting a
both
kur,
parties agree that he's not going to take it. He's only going to take a half there and then.
right?
So, and the buyer says, that's fine with me. I'll take it at this time. And he says, I'll go next, I'll get it for you at that same price because the market is stable and I know I can get it. At that point, it's solidified.
Right.
If he has if the seller has a problem getting access to that at that price, that's on him because that's what the agreement is. And there should be no exception as far as that.
Except that it appears, you're 100% right, but it appears to be a windfall to the buyer because the buyer is now getting something that he didn't bargain for. The buyer is getting a half a kur worth more money, and that's the
but at the time he bought it, they both agreed this is a stable market. I know I'm going to be able to get it for you. I know I'm going to pay it for you because I'm going to need it. It's stable. You can't, things happen that you can't control. At that point, you've got a locked transaction. And
Right.
if
So the
he has to
halacha,
pay
yeah.
more, the seller has to pay more, that's on him. If he pays less, that's also his benefit.
Right.
That's not ribbis.
Right. So therefore, the Mishnah says, V'chein hashar. If the marketplace was established and he gave him half of the kur, and the other half he could immediately have bought from another seller to make up the difference, then it belongs to the buyer. And when the buyer gets it back, there's no ribbis. That's pshat v'chein hashar.
Right.
You're 100% right. No ribbis.
No
However,
ribbis, and it doesn't matter what the seller had to pay for
that's
it.
correct. But the problem is if there was not an established market price and he said, I'm selling it to you for 25 but I can't give you 25. I can only give you half of a core. The other half I'll get you at a later point in time.
Then
And there was no
that sale
established
shouldn't be
price.
allowed.
That's ribbis, right? So later on, when he buys it for 30,
Then he sells it for 30. He says, I can only sell you.
No, because the buyer gave him all the money already. The buyer gave him the 25 dinner and said, I'm paying you and I'm
Well,
out of
there's only one of two options. Either that's a solid transaction that he's
Yes.
paid for, and if there's at that point there's risk, it's either I can't sell it to you, I can only sell you half, and I'll sell you the rest when it becomes available at the price I pay for it. He
Good.
should not be able to pay for the whole thing at that price.
Michael, if he says that, you're 100% right. There's no risk.
But if he puts it on layaway and he says, I'll pay you when it comes in and I'm putting it there, and if it goes up or down.
No ribbis. No ribbis.
No ribbis.
But
Right.
if he pays him the whole thing up front and he only gets half of it, and then the other half, because there was no market for it, the seller now has to scrounge around and
He
pay
should not
30.
be allowed to sell what he can't get his hands on because the market fluctuates.
But he pledged.
Sell that.
But he
If
pledged to the
consistent with
buyer.
a halachic mindset, then there shouldn't be a sale of risk because then, it's a matter of who's the risk on.
Well, that's why I said the term risk is not really.
I know that's my term. Okay,
Your
that's
term.
what we talk about today.
Right.
But he can only have certitude. He shouldn't be allowed to sell on speculation.
That's pshat psika ala Paris, and it's forbidden. You're right. Psika ala Paris is a future contract on Paris, which appears as ribbis. And that's why the rabbi said they had a great deal of difficulty with future purchases. Now, we'll get into that a little bit later, but you're exactly right. Future uncertain purchase, where I give you the whole money, and later you have to say, wait a minute, it's costing me more to give you the same thing, pay me the difference. Oh, no. I gave you my money up front. You had my money. You owe me the kur. The fact that the kur costs you more now is your problem, not mine. Says the halacha. If there was a market price and it changed later on, that's on the seller, no ribbis. If the market price changed and the buyer, and there was no established market price, and the buyer said, I'm giving you my money and I want you to give me a kur, that's fine. He gave him half the kur. Now he's giving him the other half of the kur, but the other half of the kur, the market fluctuated and is now worth 30 instead of 25. That's a windfall to the buyer because, listen, the buyer can now take 30, he can sell it for 30 and buy something else and have a windfall of 5 dinner. He has a windfall of 5
Right,
dinner.
I understand, but he shouldn't be allowed to sell that if the market is not established until he has.
That's correct. If the market is not established, he can't sell it and it would be ribbis. That's what we're saying. That if the market was not established and he did not have it in his possession, we're talking about the seller, then the whole transaction is a condition on a future price, and the halacha is a future price is ribbis.
So he should not be allowed to take the whole amount for the full core. He should only be allowed to take the amount for the half core.
That's correct. But he's taking it all up front. So now he's locked in because he took it all.
But you're saying the halacha doesn't allow him to do that. So
That's
the money
correct.
is on account.
But he did it anyway. The halacha doesn't allow him, but he went ahead and made a transaction.
Well, but then it should favor the buyer to say, okay, since you took all of it, that's your risk, seller, and you're going to have to produce one way or another, and it's not on the buyer. And if he benefits, great.
Right. So here's the distinction. The halacha says, again, you have to accept this as the halacha. The halacha says that if I'm buying it and the seller can sell me all of it, b'shas ma'isa, right now.
He has the ability to sell him all of it now. That's what you're saying.
That's the key. But if there's no established market price and he only gives him a half a core, then that's where the risk comes in, your term risk. And therefore, if later on it costs more to buy that same half a core, then the buyer is getting a windfall because he only bargained for 25 core and 25 dinner, and he's getting back total 30 dinner worth of no fault of his own. But the seller didn't have it in his possession. He now has to run out and get it. That's called ribbis. That is what.
But wait a minute, Rabbi. If the seller affirmed that I have it, I'll get it for you.
Yes.
If he didn't, that's on him. That's not ribbis. He said I have it. He trusted him to have it. He was not telling the truth, and he should suffer the consequences of what happens in that situation.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. If the seller lies and says I have it and I don't have it, okay, so we'll have to look at that. But from a pure standpoint of halacha, the difference of whether it's in the seller's possession or not determines what's ribbis. You're saying, wait a minute, what happens if the seller says I have it and don't have it, and there's no market for it? Now the seller has to go out and has to buy it, and he's paying more. Why should the buyer suffer? That's your point. That's your point, is why should the buyer suffer if the seller was not truthful? The teretz is, if the seller wasn't truthful, then he's stuck with it. Of course he's stuck with it because he was not truthful. He was not truthful. The halacha only says if you have a buyer and a seller and they're both kosher people and no one is cheating anybody else, then the distinction is whether the seller has it or doesn't have it. If he has it, no ribbis. If he doesn't have it, then there's ribbis. But in the case where the buyer, like you're saying, the seller is not truthful, he says, I have it, no problem. And then later on, it turns out he never had it, and there was no established price. See, the established market price is important because he could have bought it. He didn't, but he could have bought it. Therefore, there's no ribbis. But if he couldn't have bought it because the price fluctuated up and down, that's where the halacha says, be very careful because that's ribbis. So the buyer and the seller need to talk it out and need to say very carefully, what are we doing here? And if the seller says, there's no market for this, by the way, buyer, I'm only selling you half at this, and later on, whatever I get it for, I pledge to give it to you, that's ribbis. The buyer is now knows that he can't get his entire purchase at this point in time. He has to wait for the fluctuation of the market, and that is considered ribbis. Now, ribbis goes both ways. The seller can't give ribbis, and the buyer can't receive ribbis. It isn't a one-way street. The buyer is not allowed to accept ribbis.
But Rabbi, in that second part of the example, and he paid for it, the price is not established. So he's putting money down that is not a sale of that remaining amount.
Correct.
So he's not allowed to sell. That is not a sale at that point.
Well, okay, that you're saying it's not a sale, but
well, if he's saying
Michael, if I only gave you half the money, you're 100% right.
But even if I gave you the entire money and it's established market and the seller says I can get it for that, case is closed. He bought the whole thing. Right. If he can't get it, then he
still gave him all the money. He gave him all the money.
But he gave him all the money under the pretext tense that I will get you the full amount at
Correct.
this price.
Correct.
Otherwise, the seller should not have taken the rest of the money.
Correct.
So
And therefore, by
therefore,
taking the money and not having an established price, he's created a scenario
Right.
of ribis.
right. And that's on him. That's on the seller.
But it's still called ribis. You're right, it's on the seller.
But why should the buyer suffer in that case? He should be permitted, or the sale should never have been allowed.
Again, you're right in a different forum. You're 100% right, but the halacha says that when someone is paying ribis, the receiver can't receive ribis. You're right. The buyer did nothing wrong here. Did everything right. But by definition, because there was no established price and he didn't have the food in his possession, it's called ribis. But that's all on the seller. So the seller is going to find a way to give him a half a kur, but he's going to pay more money. The buyer says, I can't accept that. That's ribis to me because I'm getting more value than what I paid for. And by definition, getting more value than you paid for is ribis. That's
So if
considered
that's
ribis.
the case, then he should have to return the remaining funds to the
Correct.
buyer, and then the sale was only for a half. The
If that's the
sale was
yes.
voided, and then it goes.
Yes, yeah, that would be a solution. Correct. That would be a solution. But the buyer is saying, wait a minute, I paid you. I want my produce. And the seller is saying, I'll get you the produce. It'll cost more money. And we're saying, not allowed. Not allowed for the seller to pay more money and give it to him, and not allowed for the buyer to receive it because the buyer can't receive ribis. So ribis is a two-way street. It's a seller and a buyer. Each of them has to be whole. If one of them is not whole because he's paying ribis, then that is a derivative to the other fellow that he's getting ribis. And getting ribis and giving ribis are the two sides of the same coin. This is what makes this very, very complicated, is because you're in the abstract, in our parlance, you're right, Michael. There shouldn't be ribis here. It's a transaction, but the halacha says that psika al haperos, a future purchase on peros, the exact way we're describing it, where there's no fixed price. That's the definition of ribis. That the Chachamim say that's ribis.
So, Rabbi, if a seller abuses this continually, does the Beis Din have the right to take away his ability to sell?
Well, the Beis Din should have to step in and say, you're creating a market for ribis, and we have to do something. I mean, there has to be some penalty in order for.
The penalty is simple. You should force the seller to make good because he predicated it on the fact that he could deliver.
Right. But the seller was taking a risk, quote, a risk, by saying, you know what, maybe it'll go down in value and then I'll be able to buy more.
But that's his decision. Why should anyone else suffer because he makes that business?
And that's a very good question. And so the halacha says that since the seller is stepping into it and making a bad choice, the buyer has to beware that if he's going to accept what the seller's giving him, then he is not only is the fellow paying ribis, but he's receiving ribis, and that's improper.
To put the buyer in that position where he has to take an oath, where he's nothing to do with it, and he has to swear, it's shifting the responsibility.
It's shifting the responsibility.
Most buyers will not take the oath because they don't want to risk the ramifications of a false oath.
Okay, so because ribis is such a difficult concept, the Chachamim laid down parameters. They said if the seller has everything, no ribis, even if it went up in price. If the seller doesn't have everything, then if it's an established price, okay. If it's not an established price and he doesn't have everything, then you run the risk of ribis. First of all, the seller may be able to go a day or a month later and buy it for 25. There may not be ribis here because he'll buy it for the same price. It's only if the price fluctuates and there was no established price and he didn't have it, all those conditions make ribbis. I understand your frustration, Michael. That's why I said this is a difficult concept.
But it's enabling the seller to play games, and it shouldn't. If the halacha wants to be true, it shouldn't allow the seller to take those chances.
But wait a minute, playing games, he could lose half the purchase.
That's on him. He took the money.
Right, exactly right.
And he should suffer the consequences.
Right.
Why should the halacha protect him?
Well, the halacha is not
being aggressive.
Yeah, the halacha is not protecting him because there is punishment here. I have to take a look at that in the mitzvah of ribbis. In fact, I'll look it up and I'll be able to tell you that when you transact in ribbis, there is, whether it's malchus or whatever, there is a punishment. You don't walk away scot-free. There is a punishment. The question is, can the transaction go through, notwithstanding any punishment? And the answer is, transaction can't go through because the buyer and the seller are not aligned. And you're right, the buyer did nothing wrong. He paid him all the money, he took half of it, but if the seller says, there's no established price and I don't have it, do you want to make this transaction? The buyer could have said, no, I don't want to make a transaction with you if there's no market price and you don't have the transaction. I'll pay you half, like you just said. I'll pay you half and you'll give me a half and we'll walk away. A month from now, if I need, we'll do a new transaction. You're 100% right. But it's on the buyer as well as the seller to know the terms of their deal. So we're putting as an onus on the buyer. You're saying the buyer shouldn't have any achrayus.
The buyer wants to buy it. If the seller can't sell it, then the seller
should
own up
buy
to the fact I can't do this.
No, then you're 100% right. The buyer should say, I can't buy it from you. You're 100% right. The buyer should say, if the seller tells him there's no market and I don't have it, the buyer should say, I can't buy from you.
Honestly, he may be hurting another seller, and the halacha is always worried about, pricing out. So this seller in particular wants to corner the market because he wants to get market share and he wants to gain volume. So if he proves that he doesn't have it, he's going to lose the ability to sell. So he's trying to take business away from somebody who does have it. There are consequences to other people here that the halacha is ignoring.
Right. So again, we can go around and around on this, but
I'm sorry for being so.
No. It's a very thorough. But let me just give you the punchline to this Mishnah. So what we just said was that the buyer then came to the seller and said, I want wine. And so the seller said, I have your chitin. I have it. So there's no ribbis. I have your chitin, and it's worth 30, and I'm going to pledge to you 30 dinar worth of wine. So right now there's not a problem because the 30, the increase of the 30 was on when the seller had the chitin. So there's no problem.
There is a problem, Rabbi, because the wine may not be the quality that he wants. So
No. Let's put the wine aside. As far as the chitin is concerned, there is no ribbis on the chitin because we're dealing with a situation where the seller had the chitin or there was a market price, and therefore everything is kosher even though it's worth 30, not 25. Okay, now let's go forward. So now he's going to have to acquire. The seller is going to go out into the marketplace and buy the wine. And what is going to happen is, because what happens if the price of the yayin increases, price of wine increases, right? Then what does he do? If the price of wine increases, that's ribbis, because he never had it. Remember, he didn't have it in his possession, and there was no established price. So if the ribbis will be not in the chitin, the ribbis will be in the yayin, because he's taking 30 dinar of wine, and he's not going to get the value for 30 dinar because of the fluctuation. The point being here is that the first half of this transaction was 100% okay, either because he had it in his possession or there was a market price, whatever you want to say. Once the buyer came to the seller and said, you know what, I don't want my chitin, I want you to give me the money because I want to buy wine. Now the guy and the seller says, no problem. I'll get you 30 dinar of wine, and it'll be, let's say, a gallon for 30 dinar. When the time he goes into the marketplace, 30 dinar only buys him three-quarters of a gallon. He doesn't get his gallon because the price fluctuated. That's ribis. That is ribis because the valuation was not established. He didn't have it in his possession, and the market price
But
changed.
the difference there, Rabbi, is that the original deal was for the wheat.
Right.
So the fact that he wanted to shift the currency to wine is a different situation altogether. So he's changed the transaction from the original transaction.
Right. And the
And
Mishnah
the
is saying,
buyer should not be allowed to do that
right.
without offer and acceptance.
Okay, so the Mishnah is telling us exactly what you just said. The portion of the wheat is 100% kosher, and if it ended there, there would be no ribbis. But let's take it to the next level. You're right, that's the end of the story. Now, take it to the next level, and the buyer says, I don't need enough any more wheat. I need wine. So if you give him the 30 core, which he's entitled to, end of story. He goes into the marketplace, he buys as much wine as 30 core will allow. But if the seller says, you know what, no problem, I'll give you a gallon of wine that you're looking for 30 core, because I owe you 30 core, then he's opening himself up to a possible transaction involving ribis, because when he goes out, the seller doesn't have the wine. He goes into the marketplace and there was no established price for the wine, and the person he's buying it from says, I'll give you three-quarters of a gallon for 30 kur. But wait a minute, I owe my buyer a gallon. So I'm going to have to pay more than 30 kur. That's ribis. That is the future contract, not on the wheat, but on the wine later on.
But that's a
Therefore,
separate agreement. That
right.
wasn't the original agreement.
No,
That's
no,
a
no.
separate
It's a separate
transaction.
agreement if he takes his money. No, no, you're right. It's a separate agreement if the buyer takes his money and goes out into the market and wants to buy wine, and the seller comes to him and says, I can get you wine. Now we have a demarcation of an agreement, of a deal and a deal. But this
But
deal is intertwined in the other deal.
yes, but he's saying, I think he's saying at that point, I'm going to get you the 30 worth of wine at that price.
And the
And
price then was
turns
for
out
a
to be
gallon.
more. If he makes that commitment and says he can do it, and he can't, again, it's the seller's mistake representing that he can do it in a separate transaction, and he should be obligated to follow through on it.
And you would be right in the abstract, except that the halacha says this is what the halacha imposes: is that it's not ribis if one of two conditions
So,
occur.
Rabbi, next week, can you explain the rationale of the Chachamim in this definition that calls all this ribis?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it states that this is ribis, but it doesn't say why.
Okay.
Is there a rationale why they think this is ribis?
Okay. Because the appearance of a profit that you didn't bargain for, and that's why future contracts are not valid in the whole, because a future contract means that you're going to inherently get more than you bargained for. And by definition, if you get more than you bargained for, that's ribis.
But you may get less than you bargained for because it can go in the other direction.
Right. In which case, if it goes in the other direction, then then there would be ribis on the other end. There would be ribis to
See,
the
to me, the oxymoron is that, if he says, I got it and I can get it for you, and that's okay,
yeah,
even though it's speculative,
right.
but that they'll permit because there's an established market in this, but things could change in a heartbeat. But then when it comes to these future transactions, which is also speculative, we don't want it. It's like they're talking out of both sides of their mouth.
Right. Okay. So we'll dig into this. You're right. We'll dig into this a little bit further next week, so that maybe there's an understanding rationale. But right now, understand that the halacha says that there is no ribis if a person buys and has control of all the purchase and the price increases, then it increases for him, not for the seller, no ribis. If the seller does not have the produce and says, but I'm going to get it for you, then the question is there an established market price for which he can immediately buy it? Even if he doesn't buy it, Michael, but as long as the established market price was that he could have turned to the other guy and says, give me 25 dinar, and he gives it to him, even though he didn't, there's no longer ribis because he could have gotten it.
Yeah,
However,
he says he could have gotten it at that price. And that's what, but later on, if it's for a future time when, let's say the market has been established for 2 years and you say in a month from now I want it, you won't allow it to do it. But now, a week from now it's okay. It's just inconsistent.
no. So here's the point, the final point we'll make. If there was an established market price and the seller did not go to his friendly neighbor seller and says, sell me the 25 dinar, he didn't do it, but there was a market price, then a month later, the market shifted and the buyer says, I'd like my other half a kur, then there's no ribis, even though the seller didn't have it at the time, but he could have gotten it because there was an established price. He could have gotten it. It's as if he got it. That's the point that
so that by that logic, then you could take that out 2 years from now because
Correct.
the market has been established, and
Correct.
so therefore he could have gotten it then. So so then the buyer is, the buyer is safe. The seller is on the hook to produce it whenever it is, and that change in
and
price,
there's no ribbon. And
even
there's
if
no
it
ribbon.
benefits him, the seller, it's locked in because at that point he could have done that. That should be the end.
That is correct. That is correct. And again, it sounds a little bit odd that just because he could have had it at the time, that should take out ribis. But halach, the Rabbanan say that as long as he could have gotten it at the same time, we'll consider it as if he did, and the increase in price will belong to the buyer, not the seller.
So,
The whole
Rabbi,
theory
why
here
doesn't they why don't they make him certify that if he sells it at that time?
they do. They do. They tell him to certify it because the market price was clear.
So then
If the
it
seller
wards
was
off
not smart,
anything that changes at that point in time.
anything
Whenever
that
he
changed,
wants it, as long as they agree to the time he wants it, then it's no ribis and that's it.
correct. Correct.
But it sounds like the contracts were not as specific as that.
Well, that's why. That's why it has to be specifically, the Gemara says, or the Mishnah says, if the common knowledge was that anybody could buy a kur of wheat for 25 dinar, then it's not necessary for the seller to have it in his possession because he could get it. You're right. A month later, he can't get it. But that's not ribis anymore, and the buyer can receive it because bishas at the time of the sale, he could have gotten it. Remember, the whole principle here is that any increase in value is on the buyer's watch, not the seller's watch. If it's on the buyer's watch, there's never ribis.
So why doesn't the halacha only allow that kind of instance for futures? In other words, why doesn't it say you can only sell the remainder if you can certify at that point that you are able to get it now, and then you're locking in?
That's exactly what we're saying, that if he can certify that I could buy it today because the market allows me to buy it today, but I choose not to, then later on when I pay 30 instead of 25, there's no ribis anymore.
So that wipes out all discussion of ribis. That I didn't understand.
Correct.
Thank you.
Correct. No ribis at all. So there are a couple of, and this is the kind of the, and we'll get into this next week, is that the Torah ribis is pretty straightforward. I can't lend you something and get back more. That's simply the only Torah prohibition on ribis. I can't lend you and get back more. It's the Chachamim who said, I get it, but there's a bigger world than just lending. There's business going on. You mean to tell me that in business everything flies? Say the Chachamim, no, we have to create kind of a fence. We have to create a parameter in which ribis does not exist in the business world. And that's why in the business world, as opposed to the lending world, it's much more complicated. Because in the business world, something that appears to be out of order, if you didn't follow the steps, is out of order. And we just gave all this discussion we had today shows that it's out of order unless the buyer buys the whole thing. The seller has it in his possession or could have gotten it in his possession immediately for that price. Then what happens later is not ribis because it's all on the buyer side. The buyer got the value of the increase, not the seller. So the buyer isn't getting ribis. That's what he paid for. If I buy from you and I get a windfall of appreciation, that's okay. I buy a stock and it's on my watch, I get the benefit. Of course, I paid for it. I took a risk. I paid. But if I didn't take a risk and we're saying no, that I'm going to get my possession later, then the seller is taking the risk. And if the seller has to take the risk, the buyer has to be aware that there is ribis. So the buyer needs to be on the ball. And when he buys it, he needs to talk it out with the seller. I know you have Rahmanas on the buyer because he seems to be the innocent guy. But between two people who are obviously balalacha, the buyer and the seller have to be on the same wavelength. The buyer needs to know what he's buying. Seller needs to know what he's selling. And the buyer could say, I don't agree. I don't agree to buy half of it and then you don't, and there's no established price, and you're going to come 6 months from now and you're going to give me something that's worth well more than what I paid. I'm going to get ribis. The buyer has to worry about ribis. Okay, the seller says, I'll be happy to do it, but the buyer has to worry about ribis that he's getting something he didn't bargain for.
But Rabbi,
Yeah.
if the weather, let's say it was dry, and then the next crop, this is 6 months out, and it rains, and the crop is, very strong, and the price goes down, and it's, because it was established at that point in time, the buyer, the seller gets the windfall because it was locked in and he could have provided at that
Correct.
time. The buyer doesn't have any recourse at that
No
point.
recourse.
Okay.
No recourse.
Okay.
All right. Again, we're tackling a very complicated halacha. We've got to get our arms around it so that we understand and we can go forward with all the nuances. But that's why I said ribis is a very, very difficult concept. We have to understand it, not from the Torah side, because it's fairly straightforward, but from the Rabbanan side, where the Rabbanan created all kinds of hoops. So, Mitzvah Shem, next week, we'll sort of go into the Rashis, explain the Rashis. I'm going to look further because the halacha on ribis is that there is a punishment. I think it's malchus. I have to go back and check. And so, in other words, you don't get away scot-free. The seller can't. It's not a free-for-all where the seller can do what he wants to do, and later on, oh, big deal, it was ribis. I'm not paying you. There are consequences, and we'll go through that, and then we'll start understanding in the Gemara. But to the point that we made here today, it's very important to keep in mind that a future contract without an established price is ribis. A future contract, and that's why the Rabbanan forbade future contracts, except where there was an established price. If there was an established price at the time of the sale, then a futures contract is different. But if there was no established price and we're going to sort of wing it, then we run into the problem of ribis. So
does that mean options on Wall Street are illegal?
Again, if you're dealing between two Jews, you got to be very mindful of that. On Wall Street, we're dealing with the Hamonam. But if it was a Jewish company, that you were doing trading options with, then you have an issue of ribis, and it has to be carefully. Has to be now.
I was just referring to if you go online and buy options.
But we haven't even talked about this. But there are halachic creations which get around ribis. I didn't even want to talk about that now. In other words, because of the situation that you say, options, there are ways of getting around it by establishing a future price and saying, it's going to be X dollars regardless of what the amount will be. Then if you then get that money later, it's not ribbis. Again, it's too complicated to
Yeah,
just
okay, no, this was plenty. This was,
yeah. This is a
clear.
mouthful. So Mitzvah Shem, we're going to get to all of that, but I wanted to establish the ground rules that the ground rules for Neshech and the ground rules for Tarbis, which is Ribbis. We'll go over it again briefly next week, and then we'll pick up from there. But you get the picture. This is not going to be an easy subject to navigate, but Mitzvah Shem, we will.